Is it a case of just people not wanting affordable units in their area because of the stigma that's around quote unquote affordable housing, with having a certain, how they might see it, undesirable population living there? Is that what it could be, in your opinion?
Well, many of the neighborhoods that don't want affordable housing just don't want any housing. I think I always talk about when I do these book events from Generation Priced Out. I always talk about how people in Berkeley, many of them who live in Elmwood and areas where oppose any changes to density, they don't see the traffic on Highway 80 because it's pretty far from them. And Sacramento, before the COVID, had 140,000 people driving from Sacramento to the Bay Area for their jobs.
That's insane.
Just think about that.
For those that don't know, that's like an hour and a half, 2-hour drive, depending on traffic.
Yeah, and because you can take the Amtrak to Berkeley, but the time would take forever on a train. So people drive, and so when we say we don't want apartments we don't want a 60-foot or an 8-story building on University Avenue or San Pablo, these heavy thoroughfares, we're saying we'd rather have the people create greenhouse gas emissions by moving to Sacramento, where housing is cheaper. I mean, Sacramento's had a big increase in it when we had the Bay Area economic boom in recent years. Sacramento's population has gone through the roof, and their housing prices and everything, because people are moving to Sacramento and commuting to Oakland, commuting to San Francisco, commuting to Berkeley. You get a job at UC Berkeley, you can't live in Berkeley. And so it's a climate change issue as well as an affordability issue. And yet people just are in denial about it.
All right. That voice you heard was the voice of our guest, Randy Shaw, author of Generation Priced Out. And we are going to talk about housing policy now in the new Biden administration, and also housing in the COVID era. But before we bring on our guest, let me bring on my co-host, my homie, my dog, Mr. Pascal Robert.
Brother Jason Miles, how are you living, my brother?
I'm doing all right. Doing good. We have a total packed house tonight. I'm actually pretty excited for the show. It was fun having everybody on a party line, if you will, before we started. So let's bring out our guest. His name is Randy Shaw. He, again, is the author of Generation Priced Out. He's also the editor of Beyond Chron and director of San Francisco's Tenderloin Housing Clinic. He also wrote the activist Handbook, Winning Social Change in the 21st Century, and Beyond the Field, Cesar Chavez, the UFW, and the Struggle for Justice in the 21st Century. And he's the author of The Tenderloin, Sex, Crime, and Resistance in the Heart of San Francisco. So, without any further ado, coming all the way live from San Francisco, California, Mr. Randy Shaw.
That's quite an introduction, Jason. Thank you.
How are you this evening?
I'm doing well. It's fun to hear what I was saying when we previously interviewed, because there has been a little progress in Berkeley and Sacramento since that time.
I was reading some of your newer articles in Beyond Chron, your site, which I'll put a link up to in the chat for everybody to see it. Also put a link up to your latest book, Generation Priced Out. And what I really appreciate is you have a very honest take, especially when it comes to local politics. Sometimes these guys do things right.
It's interesting because I do criticize Berkeley a lot in the book, and you saw in that interview, and ever since we elected Terry Taplin in last November in a really big, elections have consequences, and we elected a real pro-housing activist who's just changed the whole culture of Berkeley. We've now ended exclusionary zoning. We're on the progress of ending exclusionary zoning. Terry is pushing a plan that was in Cambridge that I think every city should have, which is 100% affordable housing overlay. So you can build affordable housing in every part of a city. And people who don't want market rate housing, this is affordable housing. You should let it happen everywhere. And he just a lot of reforms that Terry has really been the driving force for him. The whole council has moved toward a more pro-housing direction. So I always say those that despair about what's going on in the cities they live, Berkeley shows how things can change. Cambridge has changed. Sacramento, it changes. It's not at the pace we often like, but it's still moving in a good direction.
Now, my co-host had some questions for you. Pascal, are you prepared with your questions, brother?
I am prepared with my questions, Randy. It was a pleasure meeting you, and I look forward to engaging you. The first question I want to ask you is, how has the coronavirus situation precipitated the already existing housing crisis that existed in the U.S. pre-COVID-19, or exacerbated, I should say?
Well, it created a situation where you're facing tens of millions of evictions, and that's unprecedented. It's the worst housing crisis since the Depression, and people who watching this show probably have followed the national and state reforms. But there's a silver lining that I want to bring up that relates to the topic of the president's position. The silver lining is that housing is a front page issue. Housing is a national issue. We always had the problem, really, for the last 40 years with homelessness, is that it was seen as a local issue, even though it was a federal responsibility. But now with the mass eviction crisis, because people couldn't pay rent for almost a year now because they've lost jobs, you see Biden talking about affordable housing routinely. You see Biden talking about homelessness, which was not the case with either Obama or Clinton, the last two Democratic presidents. So the silver lining of the terrible crisis we've suffered is there's a growing movement and a larger movement than we've ever seen that's having an impact on the politics of the country.
So are you optimistic that COVID is obviously a tragedy, but would you argue that the crisis in and of itself created an opportunity to have a policy discussion that under normal circumstances perhaps would not have been had, that may end up having positive policy results?
Absolutely, because once you start talking about the crisis of evictions and the health impacts, the educational impacts, people like me have been talking about this for 40 years. But I thought it was amazing when Biden included $213 billion for affordable housing in his infrastructure bill, because advocates like me have been always saying that housing is infrastructure, but when every time there was an infrastructure bill, it'd be roads, highways, bridges, never housing. Now we got $213 billion. So it's definitely opened up opportunities that have not been there before.
Wow. Okay. Is the politics of housing advocacy, in your opinion, too contingent on the economic norms of the real estate industry and development paradigms? Does combating those models become a necessary prerogative of housing advocacy?
Well, I think it depends what sector of the market. And I think that the biggest problem, and if you deal with homelessness as I do every day in my organization, it really comes down to federal money. And, so the federal government decides because of COVID to use FEMA money to put people up in tourist hotels. They could have done that before COVID. I mean, the federal government could spend the money, and hopefully it will now under Biden. So for the real low income people and below, and even many working people, federal assistance is essential. A lot of people are shocked when I say that 75% of eligible households for federal housing assistance do not get it. 75%. Imagine if they all got it. You think we'd have homeless people sleeping in every street, in every city? I don't think so. So I think a lot of it is that the real estate issues are an issue that happens in another sector of the economy. But I think what is encouraging about what's happening now, and I've never been so encouraged about any president we've elected in my lifetime, who's actually saying he wants to end the homelessness crisis and allocating the money to do so.
Now, oh, so go ahead, Pascal. I was going to say something.
So, I mean, in your assessment, do you really think that the crisis plus Biden's posture on the crisis demonstrates a somewhat of a structural shift in the federal government's attitude towards housing? Would you argue
I,
that?
I absolutely do. And just to be clear, real estate is a problem. I'm very focused on my organization is the main sponsor of a bill in California to stop these kind of evictions that speculators do, and the real estate industry is the big proponent of those evictions. So I don't want to diminish the problems that real estate has caused, but I would call it a tectonic shift because Clinton actually made federal housing worse. And when Obama came in, he assembled a great team, but he never allocated any money. And Biden, we didn't have an expectation originally. A year ago, if you said that Joe Biden was going to come up with these massive funding plans for housing, we'd say Biden's never been involved in housing. He has no history in housing, but he is into it unlike any president we've had.
And I wanted to ask you kind of about those evictions, and I know you kind of hinted at it because in this COVID economy, because the previous administration didn't have any like real rent forgiveness or mortgage forgiveness, we are facing potentially a very large eviction crisis. Hopefully not. We're hoping that this administration can handle the numbers that were being projected early on in the pandemic of like 10 million people possibly facing homelessness. So do you see this new you actually see the bailout program from Biden actually working? I know there's been some great steps made in San Francisco about trying to house more people in the SROs.
I do think the deal at the federal level, which the moratorium was now being extended. I mean, California's moratorium has some, the problem in California is if a landlord doesn't want to do it, tenants are on their own, but there's rental subsidies. But, if the landlord wants to go along with the state plan, then all the tenants are safe. So, and many do. I mean, the real estate industry, rents have they started to go up again. But, big picture, because of incredible grassroots activism led by a coalition of over 2,000 groups put together by the National Low Income Housing Coalition and other groups, we had an unprecedented level of activism on the ground this past year to force even the Trump administration to do something to stop evictions. And now for Biden to go further and actually fund the rental relief that's needed. So we didn't have this grassroots movement. I mean, that's just a fact. We did not have it in 2009. We did not have a housing movement that is anywhere close to what we had now. And so Obama got away with not funding us adequately. Clinton, we had no movement, and he was never interested in funding affordable housing. So,
well, I also wanted to add this to the landlord tenant rent relief thing, and I think you kind of hinted on it. So, from my understanding, I could be wrong here. Please correct me if I'm wrong. The landlord has to file paperwork as the tenant has to file paperwork if the tenant wants to get the rent relief, right?
Well, the challenge is it's a deal where if the landlord agrees to take 80%, it's all fine.
Mm-hmm.
And the legislature should not have reached a resolution which allowed discretion to the landlord to say, I don't want it. But practically speaking, the large landlords that you hear about all want it because who are they going to? They're getting public money in exchange for not evicting tenants. Mm-hmm. So landlords were at the federal level. The landlord groups were all opposing this bill, and it's like Diane Yenta would say, "Wait, we're giving millions of dollars to you, and you're opposing the bill." They're so anti-government, even when government's giving them money. But obviously, there's a problem if you're a long-term rent-controlled tenant. And your landlord sees a way to get you out by not participating. And that's why cities like San Francisco and other cities, and there's some state money, are coming up with ways to try to help those tenants. Because there are tenants still at risk. I don't want to diminish that.
And I think that was my kind of fear, because it just reminded me, and I know it's not the same thing. It just reminded me of the whole kind of mortgage forbearance modification programs that the Obama administration was talking about in 2009 during the mortgage crisis. And my fear is that this would get caught up in similar kind of, I don't want to say red tape, but just kind of not go anywhere. But, to your point about larger landlords just wanting some money, I agree with that.
You raise an issue that probably we'd have a separate show on, which has already become clear, which is that whenever you rely on federal money or government money, it always takes longer to arrive than what we hope, right? Mm-hmm. And there's always bureaucracies. You have to apply, they have to submit regulations, and people get frustrated during that time. And so we have to make sure to deal with that. And when things are going slow at the government, we need to make sure they're not. And we can't allow holdups. We have to make sure the money gets to people in a timely fashion. So that does become a challenge, but I think we're up to it.
Did you have a question for him, Pascal?
I actually wanted to slight digression, and I appreciate your evaluation of the Biden administration. I know that some of your writing is based on gentrification, and particularly for Black communities throughout the country, gentrification has really been considered a type of kind of almost ethnic cleansing, if you will. I was wondering if for your research, have you developed any kind of effective strategies where working class, poor, or even middle class communities can fight this consistent and consistent gentrification phenomenon that we see in cities throughout the country?
Well, my book on the Tenderloin is a whole book. It talks about how we stopped the Tenderloin, which everybody said would be a gentrified neighborhood by now, and it's permanently working class. Permanently, it's the only neighborhood in San Francisco that'll always be affordable. So I've done it my own life, and in terms of our work, and laid it out in that book and in my activist handbook and how we've done it. But I mean, obviously, it's not rocket science to figure out how to stop gentrification. You just stop displacement, and then and many people, like we have like 40 states. I don't know if people know this. There's over 40 states where cities are not allowed to enact rent control or just cause eviction laws. Think of that for a second. Seattle cannot enact just cause eviction or rent control. Denver cannot do so. Chicago cannot do so. Boston cannot do so. And then those cities wonder why they have gentrification. And I write in Generation Price Stat about an African-American community in Denver that went from being a blighted neighborhood 5 years later to being so gentrified the community was torn apart because they have no rent control and no just cause eviction, so tenants can't be protected. Those are kind of the building blocks for any anti-gentrification campaign.
Wow, so it really starts at a policy level where we have to demand that those types of protections are guaranteed to tenants and renters so they won't be displaced. That's a very interesting correlation that I never really thought about that.
Well, especially when Washington is a Democratic state, Illinois is a Democratic state, Massachusetts is a Democratic state, and so is Colorado, and yet their legislatures are not allowing the local cities to enact rent control. We're not talking about this now in Oregon that the state government actually did enact rent control. But here we have these Democratic states where they're not letting these high rent cities protect their tenants and stop gentrification. It's got to change. And by the way, I just noticed someone had a comment, California doesn't have rent control. Actually, in 2019, California passed a rent limitation, a statewide rent limitation and just cause eviction law, similar to what Oregon did. So California actually has statewide protections.
And someone just commented on Oregon. We have found that more than a few Democratic state legislatures are landlords themselves.
Well, the real estate industry heavily gives to Democrats. That's very clear in every state. And that's always been the problem, is that we think, oh yeah, California has a 2/3 Democratic control of the legislature, but try to get it. It's not easy to get a tenant bill passed.
Yeah, I had a question just along those lines. Is that dealing with the bipartisan nature of obstructionism to housing policy? How exactly do we develop a model that combats that? Of the kind of the bipartisan neoliberal limit in the options of housing activists. Is equitable housing advocacy limited by the nature of the two-party political paradigm that we have in the States?
Well, a lot of the decisions made about what you just mentioned are made at the local level where they're really all Democrats. I mean, there aren't Republicans stopping things from happening in San Francisco or Denver or Seattle or Boston or New York City. it's really the problem. The problem is so often is that the homeowners who don't want anything built anywhere in their city because they're happy with where they are, they don't want any more lines at their dinner restaurant or the movie theater. They're Democrats, and so it's almost like if they were Republicans, Democratic politicians could ignore them, but they're Democrats and they're often well off because they're homeowners. And we have, what many cities have a problem. They have off-year elections. Like Los Angeles for years had elections where their council members were elected with, and this is an absolute fact they talk about in Generation Priced Out, they'd have 13% voter turnout. 13%. And then they finally, in 2016, switched it to coincide with national and state elections. They're already electing more pro-housing people in 2020.
So there's no guarantee that just a straight Democratic Party line is going to be an assurance of fair housing policy or any kind of just or equitable housing policy at all.
But at the federal level, on like funding affordable housing, Democrats are pretty much unified. It's when you get to the challenge to rent control, landlord power, development in a neighborhood that things change.
Gotcha.
Sorry, I was putting links up to Randy's book. You were supposed to follow up with another question.
I do have another question.
Go for it.
The question I wanted to ask you, Randy, is that do you think that the rise of the quote-unquote progressive movement or the Sanders faction of the Democratic Party increases the possibility of a better atmosphere or environment for fair housing discourse or policy measures being proposed at the federal level or at the state level? Are you ambivalent towards the capacity of this new constellation being able to help in that fashion, or do you think it provides a kind of better alternative than to the traditional kind of centrist corporate Democrats that we've had for the last 25 some odd years?
Well, it's interesting. Bernie Sanders is great on housing, and he's been very critical of exclusionary housing policies at the local level. Yet his Our Revolution group in Cambridge opposed 100% affordable housing overlay. So there's often a disconnect between Bernie Sanders' very progressive positions on housing policy and the people who support him at the local level who have very, very regressive views. I saw someone mention about Portland. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, is that in democratic cities, this is what my book, Generation Priced Out, kind of highlights. I'm not writing about conservative cities. I'm writing about progressive cities that see themselves as progressive, but their housing policies are regressive. The mayor of Portland is terrible. And, unfortunately, he wasn't defeated in the most recent re-election. Seattle has a very corporate mayor. Seattle has an upcoming election, which really will determine where that city is going to become more equitable in terms of housing. Look what just happened in Los Angeles with all the progressives in Los Angeles. I assume people watching this probably saw what happened at Echo Park, that atrocity of what they did with homeless people with 300 police officers. I think they spent $1 million dislodging homeless people from a park.
I wanted to talk to you about that real quick, the whole Echo Park thing, because there's a friend who's been helping out with the show and also a guest on the show actually was there, and I hit him up when the big arrest happened, and I think they said everyone here is getting arrested, and him and his wife were able to flee before they got locked up. But that's been horrible what we've been seeing in Southern California with Caltrans on Thanksgiving last year, arresting those families that were in those vacant homes, and then what's been going on with Echo Park, the people in the park. Because what I thought was so kind of cool about that whole movement down there was it seemed to be very community focused, where there were people, I mean, definitely there were people in the community that did not want these homeless people in the park, but there were also people that were helping out with mutual aid, giving tents, giving water daily.
Well, I'll just say, Jason, this is why I wrote Generation Priced Out, because I felt like it's, in our world, it's always like the villain of the Republicans and Democrats are the good guys. That's not how it works on housing policy. And when you talk about housing, you're talking about, who, as I say in the subtitle of my book, who gets to live in the new urban America. If you don't have an equitable housing policy, you have a situation like in Oakland where African Americans are leaving in mass, or Denver, or the other cities where you see displacement. It's happened in Los Angeles as well. an inequitable housing policy has a disproportionate racial impact. I talk in the book about displacement in Boyle Heights, and how they fought back to save the Latino community there. But there's a racial impact. And so we make fun of, I mean, I always sort of make fun of people with Black Lives Matter signs next to, but then they're opposing any apartments in their neighborhood. It doesn't work that way. And I will mention that what happened in LA, they spent like $1 million in local funds when FEMA's a federal funding source could have put those same people up in hotels at no city expense. So there's more going on here. There's an attitudinal problem where they're basically treating low-income people with contempt. There's no other way to, and this is in democratic Los Angeles.
Do you think that the Democrats in these cities are more interested or aligned with the real estate interests, the commercial real estate interests, than the interests of the populations that they're supporting? Or is it really that they just reflect their class tendency because they're owners themselves?
Well, I think a lot of it is that LA has been so dominated politically by homeowners and the disenfranchisement of tenants in that city across the board and people of color. And even those with color, the homeowner groups have the power in that city, and they don't, they want their parks. But it's broader. LA has 66,000 homeless people, and that was before the count. That was before the pandemic. LA's homeless numbers are going up before the pandemic. They have the worst homeless crisis in America. How does it not sharply reduce now that the federal money's there? Are they going to build more housing? We'll see. But just to be on a positive note here before we end, we never even had to think about how to spend the money before because we never had it. I got involved with homelessness began in 1982. We thought, okay, Reagan slashed HUD, things are bad, but when a Democrat comes in, it may change for the better. We never got any improvement under Clinton, never got any improvement under Obama. Now we finally have a budget, and I believe this will pass, that gives us the chance to end homelessness. So it's really going to be up to us at the local level to make sure that money is used efficiently.
My son is telling me to be quiet. I don't know if you guys can hear him. Yeah, you have to be quiet. No, you the one that's the loud one. He doesn't. It's two. I did want to ask you before I was so rudely interrupted about HUD real quick before you go. Was it Juan? One of the Castros, I can't remember which one of the twins, was the HUD secretary under Obama and was running for president, and his HUD record never really got called out, even in the debates, which I thought was interesting, as people were really, picking at the weak spots of people. And I thought his HUD record actually would have been more of a point of contention. Who is the HUD secretary right now? Well,
actually, Marcia Fudge is HUD secretary, a congresswoman from Ohio. And when she was first picked, many of us were very disappointed because she'd made a comment that she didn't want a token appointment. She has been fantastic since she got nominated. Mm-hmm. And I think she has the aggressiveness that Castro never had. She is already making it clear she wants to house people. She wants to keep people in their homes. Mm-hmm. And I think she's going to fight harder than any HUD secretary we've seen in a long time, if not ever, for that. And that's what makes me so encouraging. Because if you don't have a well-run HUD, they'll blow the money and screw it up and delay it. She wants action. So I think we got very lucky with Secretary Fudge.
Well, talking to you,
in 6 months, we'll see how it went.
I was gonna say talking to you can leave me, and actually reading some of your writing can sometimes leave me a little bit optimistic. You can't work in the industry that you work in for as long as you've been doing it and not have some level of optimism, right?
I will say, as optimistic as I often am, it's because of local measures to raise money. I never anticipated Joe Biden, of all people, would come up with this massive amount of money for housing. So everyone in my world is just shocked, and we're so used to being unhappily surprised with presidents. This is a happy surprise.
Well, Pascal, do you have any closing remarks on this?
I mean, I really appreciate the information that Randy's bringing to us. I'm going to take his optimism in the current administration at face value, based on his expertise. And
Well,
I my only
housing policy. I wasn't.
that's a very important caveat. That's correct. That's a very important caveat. But my attitude will be: we shall see. We'll see how this comes down.
Okay. Well,
before you go, I do want to ask you: do you think him taking such a strong stance on housing will have a positive effect on Gavin Newsom's chances to stay in office?
yes, and I don't think Gavin Newsom's really in any risk. And recent polls shows him way ahead. But I will say people can follow me on Beyond Chron regularly, beyondchron.org. I write about housing or homelessness almost every week, so people should check with me on that and give me whatever feedback on what I write.
Don't worry, links are going out, and everywhere this show is streaming, links are going out to Beyond Chron. There's also a buy link to Randy's book, Generation Priced Out. Good book. You see, I actually bought it. He didn't give it to me, like the other people that come on here.
And I do have a paperback edition out that people can pick up with a new preface. So thank you.
No, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. I love again reading your stuff. It actually gives me, like I said, a little bit of hope, and it also gives me a great I worked in the field, lived in it for some time, so I definitely understand it from a certain perspective, but the policy perspective that you have sometimes I miss because I'm so entrenched in the world.
One of the chats said I should come back in a few months and see if my optimism was warranted. Let's do that, okay?
Well, we have to bring you back to ask you about the Green New Deal and how housing was going to work for that. And I know you have he can go on about housing and green housing. So that little clip you saw is 2 minutes of like an hour-long show.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. Good meeting you, Pascal.
Good meeting you too, Randy. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Randy.
Okay, bye-bye.
Have a good rest of your night. That was Randy Shaw of Beyond Chron. I'm going to be putting links up in the description. Jesus, so used to fucking saying that. Links up in the chat to Randy's blog, Beyond Chron, which he actually writes, I would say, about weekly. And usually his topics are going to cover housing and homelessness issues. Sometimes across the country, more often than not, they're going to be very localized. He's also published in LA Progressive, if you read LA Progressive daily publication. Pascal, what'd you think of Randy?
I liked his whole posture, his very directness with his answers, solutions-based kind of housing advocacy. He seemed very willing to critique the Democrats as well as the Republicans, barring his optimism about Biden. But I'm not gonna quibble with him because this is his area, and he doesn't strike me as a Democratic Party lackey, because he made it very clear that one of the major obstacles to fair housing equity in many states is the fact that they're governed by Democrats, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that he's just being very transparent about the fact that this crisis is creating a particular moment that policy measures are going to be up for debate in a way that they would not have been before. I think that's fair.
No, Randy's really fair. And that's one thing I appreciate, because sometimes we get so busy bashing people, no matter what they do. When something good comes around, we don't know how to treat it. And when a good policy is there, we don't even know how to support it and try to make it even better. So before I bring on our next guest, we're going to have a little bit of a break between our next guests. I showed this video to our guests earlier today. I'll be showing it to you guys. If you know the show, I like to throw curveballs. This video is definitely not safe for work. And this video describes a person that Pascal and I do not like. This video basically is a quick take on the Hotep. So enjoy.
What's up? What's up? Struggle is up, brother. Oppression is up, brother. salami, eggs, and bacon. My name is Dewey. Oh, ba ba ba. Ooh, mama say, mama sa, mama kusa. Jenkins.
Nigga, what?
Oh, this must be the famous revolutionary Huey Freeman. Isn't this the brother who used to be your homeboy, but then he ran away to, what was that? Whitecrest?
Woodcrest.
Whitecrest. Nah, I didn't.
Yeah, whatever. So, brother, where your poems at?
Huh?
How you gonna call yourself a revolutionary and you ain't got no poems? If you were really down with the struggle, you'd have your sandals and capris on, brother. Where your head wrap? Where your sandals? Where your capri pants? What's going on?
Oh, that was priceless. I'm watching this and I'm thinking of people who appear on my social media timeline that I'm connected to. Oh man,
How you revolutionary with no poems?
Do you have any
Mama say, mama sa, mama kusa.
Did you watch that earlier today, Gene? I sent it to you earlier today.
Yeah, I did watch that. I want to hear the poem.
He actually has a poem at the end of the show that if you want to hear me play the poem clip, if you tune in the show Saturday with Jamie Peck and Angela Walker, I will be playing that clip and several other clips. Somebody's computer is way too loud. I want to say it's Cuba.
It's Cuba. Cuba always has the deep state playing with his computer.
The deep state. So if you guys have been tuning into the show, if you're new to the show, Thursday lately has been either we bring a Marxist economist in to talk about not the economy, or we bring Cuba and Gene in to talk about foreign policy. So today we want to talk about not just foreign policy, but immigration policy. And who better to ask than immigrants?
Hello.
Hi.
Here.
Hi.
I mean, technically, Gene is the only one who is still a U.S. immigrant because both of us tried and failed.
Yeah.
And I would also say I prefer the term expat to
Oh, sorry.
You're in a semi-colonial capacity over there, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm in a colonial capacity here, visiting from the motherland.
So
Occasionally sends dispatches back to Whitehall.
Pascal had some questions for you guys on immigration. While Pascal is asking you guys immigration questions, I'm going to be putting out Randy's information into the chats. So I will bid you adieu.
I definitely have some some immigration questions for you folks, and I appreciate you guys coming on. I want to know, how does the foreign policy posture of the current administration affect its immigration policy in a way that differs from the Trump administration?
Well, I would begin by saying that on a certain level, like it depends who you're talking to, and it depends which country you're coming from. If you're coming from a developed Western country, if you're coming from Western Europe or Canada or places like that, your experience of immigration is going to be different from if you're coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and East Asia. So I think the immigration experience and the posture of the United States government has never really been particularly hostile to people like me who come from Western Europe or people from Canada. I think the only sort of critical difference is, at the moment, outside of the United States, after the harsh rhetoric of the Trump administration, I think many people from Latin America and the Caribbean are thinking this new administration will be more favorable. Whether in reality it will be more favorable to asylum seekers or not, obviously remains to be seen. But certainly the rhetoric is sort of less abrasive than before, and I think we have to recognize that. And we're seeing that people are coming to the United States now because the rhetoric of the government, at least on a certain level, seems more welcoming. Although I would note, as we talked about on chat before, the Biden administration is calling on people from Haiti in advertisements in Haitian patois not to come to the United States.
He loves the Haitians, boy. He loves the Haitians. I got it. What Cuba?
Who
What
doesn't love Haitians? All right,
Joe Biden, the Clintons, France.
I learned about Haiti as a country when I was a kid because Clinton was it was George H.W. Bush was sending Haitian refugees into detention centers. People who came over on makeshift boats were being detained, and I was asking, like, who are these people? They seem like they're in trouble. Why are they getting locked up? And my dad's like, well, Haiti is a country. And then it happened again with Clinton, and there was the aggressive intervention. Then again, every president has their anti-Haiti moment, it seems, including the white savior moment where the Clinton Foundation comes in after the earthquake and pays a bunch of money in like the circular economy. It goes to Port-au-Prince to immediately go back to consultancies in San Francisco and New York, to hire people like me to go and survey damage, ideally from climate control land cruisers, and say, yeah, that's bad. You should probably do something about that. And then you write it up in 20 words, and make a PowerPoint deck, and that's $200,000. Meanwhile, the actual reconstruction efforts on Haiti under the Clinton Foundation are largely a list of excuses and alibis for why nothing got done.
Pretty much, but we don't want to get me started on my feelings about the Clintons vis-a-vis Haiti. But Cuba, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how exactly Biden's foreign policy posture is affecting his immigration position as well. Perhaps we need to divert away from traditional European and Canadian countries. Maybe we should talk about Latin America, South America, Haiti as well. We definitely know that Biden is cracking down on Haitian immigration at a time in which Haiti is having political turmoil, and he's supporting the oppressive president of the country. How are things like what's happening in Bolivia, Central America, the crisis at the border? How do you think Biden's foreign policy is affecting his overall immigration posture? And do you think it's a better pivot than what Trump was offering?
If I may, I can speak from a Chinese angle. It's not quite Latin American, but
that would be great.
Generally, I feel like Biden's policy decisions are based on the Trump administration. So the policies that Trump made, a lot of them really hurts immigrants. Like they banned a lot of, they put a lot of obstacles for us to just be in America and.
Not just asylum seekers, but also H-1B, the legal channels to status in the United States were impeded as much as possible.
Yeah, and a lot of those are targeting specific countries like China. For example, there are 7 universities there are 7 universities in China that the Trump administration identified as with some that they have some affiliation with the military. So the Trump administration completely banned those those students from those universities to ever get an H-1B or a work visa. And that one was came at a surprise. And then so from that angle, Biden decided to revoke that policy to allow those university students to obtain a visa. But on the other hand, a lot of the Trump policies got maintained. For example, there was one that was trying to raise the wage level for H-1B work visa applicants. And that one, I think it's still debating, but it was not an immediate no. And they're kind of receiving public comments. So it's possible that they're going to pass it. And once they pass it, those workers with extremely high wage level would get in, but not those one with like basic entry level worker, or if you work at as a school teacher, you just forget about your visa. But however, like Amazon, like IBM, Microsoft, those tech companies, and the McKinsey's, those large corporations, Wall Street, they can get a visa with for their employees with no problem, because it's used to be lottery based, and then very soon it may become money based.
Wow, interesting. But do you think that Biden is maintaining the same kind of foreign policy, maybe harshness is a simple word, with China that Trump had as well, even though he may have slight alterations in terms of immigration policy? In other words, do you believe the rhetoric that the new Cold War, if you will, is a bipartisan, meaning both Democrats, both Republicans, doesn't matter kind of thing? Or was it just a phenomenon under Trump? I'd like to hear your thoughts, Summer.
I used to work on this very topic for last year. I was in a large think tank called CSIS, specifically on this topic. So generally, from my observation, I can tell that a lot of the Trump policies will be kept by the Biden administration. So Biden wouldn't immediately walk back to the Obama level. That one was long gone. The 4 years of Trump administration had done a lot to the relationship. It's just impossible to go back. Well, blame maybe on both sides or whatever, but it's just gone. There's never the same kind of trust or the patience. The patience is just gone. And I can, from what I have read, what I have seen, Biden cares about some things that Trump doesn't, like human rights. Trump barely cares about it, cares. But so those things are what Chinese hate the most. So for those things, it will be there will be a large conflict. Biden may just keep pushing China, and it's not partisan at all. I would say that both sides have a lot of. If there's one thing they can agree with each other, it may be like anti-China policies.
I think that there's a different China language that's used by Republicans versus Democrats. Republicans concentrate on economic cheating, economic exploitation. They're stealing our patents. They're taking our money, unfair competition, that kind of thing. And it's tied in with this kind of America First nativism, where there's less interest in the welfare of, or less rhetorical interest in the welfare of people abroad, and more about what's this doing to Americans? What is this doing to America? While the Democrats have an equally loud human rights language. Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tibet, Taiwan, these kinds of issues related to minorities, related to democracy and the civic liberties within China, the relationship of the government to the Chinese people, surveillance, detention, that kind of thing. And the one thing that I think that Democrats lose sight of, one thing that they don't understand, is that back in the Clinton era, or even in the Obama era, Hillary Clinton could go to China and say women's rights are human rights and deliver a bit of a lecture, and the Chinese communist leadership would take it. At this point, that's not because they agreed. It's not because they they liked it. It's not because they were ashamed about what was going on, but it had to do with strategic calculus about the relationship. At this point, now that we have much more of a balance between the two powers, the willingness to listen to what's perceived as extraordinarily hypocritical and inflammatory, moralistic, patronizing accusations, that's gone. And democratic language, which is supposed to be softer because it's based in universalism, it's based in human rights, it's based in all of these concepts that are supposed to speak to everybody, that are supposed to be part of this Enlightenment consensus, are actually much more inflammatory than the Republican complaints about money issues or strategic issues. The symbolic aggression of having Westerners, the people who conducted the Opium War, the people who began the century of humiliation, telling you how you should be nicer, better people, talking down to you from their moral high horse, is triggering. I think that's actually the appropriate word.
This is really fascinating, Kuba. So what you're saying is that within your expertise, working in foreign policy circles, what you're finding is that the Chinese are actually more offended by liberal moral posturing than the blunt, brutish, frankly, overtly xenophobic posture of the conservatives.
Yeah, you can see in China, very strangely, there are some people that kind of look forward to a second Trump administration for that particular reasons. Or that was one reason. The other reason is that Trump is so bad for Americans, so it's a good opportunity for China. But on the other hand, I believe that Trump is a businessman. He can be bought, he can be talked, he can be convinced. But if those like white liberals, they come with their human rights agenda, they just don't see any possible way to to move forward the agenda. Because
how can you reason with these people?
I mean, just consider the recent thing going around on Twitter. The United States, doing its country reports, and they did a country report on Cuba, in which one of the criticisms of the Cuban regime was that it was holding people in solitary confinement. And this is just, for people outside of the United States who are aware, and far more aware because of social media, because of, the internet, of what takes place in the United States and the criminal justice system in the United States. This bald hypocrisy is, makes the United States look like a joke. So, and I think I've said this before, the Trump America First policy is in many ways more realistic with regards to America's understanding what America's place in the world is and how the United States is perceived by people outside of the United States than the liberal internationalism that Biden wants to, bring back. So, this is the problem with ideology. The ideology of Samantha Powers and the human rights people is increasingly seen as hollow as the United States looks more and more like a country that is seriously unstable. We see this, and people are just more aware of what it's like in the United States. It's not like the 1960s, where if you were in Eastern Europe, you could imagine the United States as the land of milk and honey. People across the world know about the human rights violations that take place in the American criminal justice system. They know about the political disorder and dysfunction of the American political system. So an attempt to project the United States as, the kind of global leader that liberals like to see the United States as just does not have the same kind of purchase or cachet amongst people. If you go to Europe and ask people, would you like to emigrate to the United States? They wouldn't, unless they have a high-paid job or they do a specific profession. Most would probably want to stay in their home countries because the social safety net is better, living standards are better. You have time off when you have children. So the prestige of the United States in large parts of the world is on the decline, and the people who do come to the United States are coming because their countries are in absolute dire need. Central American countries are all but failed states. Haiti, as we've talked about, has decades of suffering brought about by maladministration and foreign intervention. So the people who come from there are coming because they don't have a choice. But the rest of the world, if there's some kind of stability in those countries, the United States doesn't look like the shining city on the hill that it might have appeared, at least, like in the 1990s. And American liberals just cannot get past that Clinton era. They're reliving the kind of dead history, and we will continue to see them hearkening back to Obama and Clinton as this kind of golden age. When
in Washington, it's always 1996. Said it once, and I'll say it again. And Pascal, you brought up the State Department country reports, and reading those, it's clear that there's two separate standards for how countries are evaluated. If you are a country with which is antagonistic to the United States, then you're evaluated to the Norwegian standard, right? Like, do your prisons have HBO? If you're a friendly, despotic regime of the United States, you're held to like the Colombian or Saudi standard, right? Where anything above a bare minimum, you're not actively putting people, at least like not too many people, in invisible detention centers. You're not disappearing more than a couple thousand, and they're all union activists anyways. You get a pass. And there's what's remarkable to me about this, it's pretty obvious why it happens, but what's remarkable to me is the cognitive dissonance in the Washington-based foreign policy and sort of human rights community, where it's considered perfectly appropriate, right? And you see this with a lot of talk about liberal interventionism. There's the human rights catastrophes that we couldn't possibly ever do anything about, like Yemen. So we have to be quiet about those, and it's just tragic. We just have to accept it. There's no point rocking the boat. And then there's the human rights disasters that need to be front and center, that need the attention of the world, and that could justify regime change, could justify any measure in order to save lives that are imminently under threat. We could talk about Libya, we could talk about the Uyghurs in China. There's always this divergence between the things that are supposed to be impossible and therefore passed over silence, and the things which are absolutely urgent. And somehow this corresponds with the posture of the United States and its foreign policy objectives in those regions.
Yeah, before the Clinton period, China joined the PRC joined UN in like 1971, I would say. At the first 2 decades, China was kind of agree a lot on the human rights issues or those progressive agendas, but it has gone through a shift. And right now, I would actually say that just precisely because of this kind of hypocrisy of the U.S., it kind of ruined the name for the human rights. It could have been a great name, but then now I don't know what it means. And so right now, like China knows it. China would ask, "What do you mean?" And if it doesn't make sense to me, I will not follow you. And so I can see it's not just China's case. I can see a lot of countries could have had a very high hope for those kind of human rights agenda until the leader kind of spoiled it.
Yeah, you need to substantiate with your own policy the rhetorical, the ideological framework for the world order you're trying to introduce, or else it's just transparently propaganda. And unfortunately, after the invasion of Iraq, after Abu Ghraib, after the black sites, the public embrace of torture by American presidents and administrations, the lack of any accountability for it under Obama, it becomes clear that the human rights agenda is not something that can be taken seriously, even by those who are committed, who would like there to be a human rights agenda.
Wow. Fascinating.
Well, it's been an hour. And
we barely talked about immigration, too.
Well, you said immigration 3 times, and that was enough for these people, right?
We met the quota.
Well, we're going to go into the after hours bonus segment of the show. We were going to take, originally, we were going to actually talk about, was it China and Iran? Are we still talking about China and Iran?
I still want to touch on that.
So we're going to talk about China and Iran. We're actually going to get more into immigration. We didn't really get the deep dive into immigration like we wanted to. Kuba was going to tell us his story of being an immigrant. Jean was going to tell us his story as well. Summer's going to tell her story too.
The part that's not redacted.
Someone had commented on Summer's name. They're like, that is like the perfect name. And I was like, oh, Summer Tan. Ha. Because I named my son Joaquin Miles because my last name is Miles. Joaquin. I thought that was funny. So Summer, your parents, give them a
I actually picked for myself. My Chinese name is not Summer.
Tell them what it is.
It's better and worse. My Chinese name is because Shining, it's SHININT, but then it's shining 10. It's not a perfect 10.
That's equally as dope.
Thank you.
So,
wow.
Yeah, my name doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, and my name is an incomprehensible string of letters drawn from a hat.
Took me 3 years to know how to remember all those letters.
Unbreakable code.
When Kuba says his name is his Wi-Fi password. Thank you guys. Thank you, moderator John Ross, for making sure people don't get out of line. Thank you, Randy Shaw, for coming down actually on some pretty short notice and giving us all this great information. There's links in the chat and wherever you're watching the show to follow Randy on the site Beyond Chron, where he actually writes, like I said, pretty much weekly or bi-weekly about housing policy. There's also links to his book, Generation Priced Out. And hopefully there's some patrons in here that are sticking around for the after hours segment. We will see you. I want to get a cool Chuck Woolery thing, like see you in 2 and 2. Are you guys old enough to know Chuck Woolery? I know Pascal is, because Pascal went to high school. Chuck.
We're just too foreign.
Yep. Never heard of him.
You don't know Chuck Woolery? Love Connection?
What?
Old American, very bad game show.
Is that like Tinder before the internet?
Yeah, but imagine instead of Tinder, you swipe and the America picks for you.
Oh my God, that sounds terrible.
So you sit there.
We had something similar in England called Blind Date.
We had Blind Date.
Oh, did you have Blind Date?
We had Blind Date. A friend of mine got his like Hollywood start on Blind Date. He's a pretty decent sized actor now, doing that bullshit. Or one of those Change of Heart. I'm sorry, you got to start on Change of Heart, which is worse than Blind Date. Change of Heart is the one where you have a significant other and you guys are having some beef, and then the host says, you know what's gonna really fuck shit up? Fuck that guy. And then you go on a date with someone else, and then if you like this someone else, you have a change of heart.
We're cursing in front of we have to stop cursing in front of Summer, man.
Oh, well, we shouldn't curse in the first hour. All the curses are for patrons.
You pay extra for that.
He's right. Pay extra for all the cursing. So thank you guys. Oh, my mom is saying something about cursing. Sorry, because I didn't learn any of this from you. None of the foul language I learned from my mother. I think my mom invented some curse words.
Can't stay for the psychotherapy.
All right, thank you guys, and we will see you in the after hours. We